Gunshots cracked through Seoul's Myeongdong Market District at 10:12 p.m. on a Thursday night. That would change everything. Amara Johnson hit the pavement hard, her street cart exploding behind her in a shower of aluminum and seasoned rice. Her apron, the burgundy one with embroidered pockets she'd sewn herself, bloomed red as she collapsed between overturned food containers, her body trembling against the cold Seoul stone. The attack lasted 17 seconds. Professional. Calculated. Efficient. Security camera footage would later confirm it. 3 masked operatives, military-grade weapons, synchronized execution. But what the shooters didn't know, what absolutely nobody knew, was that the bleeding woman gasping for air on that dirty market floor wore something hidden beneath her shirt. A single piece of solid gold hanging from a delicate chain. A name engraved on the back in sharp Korean characters that translated to one word: property. If you're loving this story so far, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and know how far our story is going. The first time Jinwoo Park noticed her, it was by accident. He hadn't planned to walk through the Myeongdong street market that Friday afternoon. His schedule was locked down. Meetings with regional distributors, negotiations with corrupt port officials, preparations for the territorial expansion that would secure his family's empire for another decade. But his driver had taken a wrong turn, and the motorcade had slowed to a crawl through the narrow market corridors. That's when he saw her. She stood behind a small food cart painted deep burgundy, her short natural curls catching the afternoon sunlight. A young black woman in a simple brown apron over faded jeans, moving with the kind of economy and grace that suggested she'd done this 10,000 times before. Her hands worked steadily, chopping vegetables with precise knife work, ladling broth into paper cups with the care of someone who understood that these small meals were someone's dinner, someone's comfort. She was laughing with an elderly Korean customer, her whole face lighting up. Genuine. Unguarded. The kind of joy that made Jinwoo's chest feel unfamiliar and tight. "Keep driving," he commanded quietly. But his eyes stayed on her until the motorcade turned the corner. Later that night, in his office on the 42nd floor of a building whose real ownership nobody could trace, Jinwoo found himself asking questions. His security chief, Minjun, appeared with a folder within the hour. Amara Johnson, 26 years old. Originally from Atlanta, Georgia. Here on an extended visa. Runs a street food cart in Myeongdong 6 days a week. Sends money back to family in the States every 2 weeks. No criminal record. No connections to any organization. No drugs, no alcohol incidents, nothing. Siblings? Jinwoo asked, his dark eyes scanning the photograph. A cousin. Lives in Gangnam. Works at a convenience store. Also clean. Financial status? Barely surviving. The cart makes enough for food and a small apartment in Itaewon. She works 18-hour days. Takes cooking classes at night. Appears to be saving for something. Probably wants to open a restaurant. Jinwoo leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. Outside his window, Seoul sprawled below him like a circuit board of lights and possibility and power. "Why am I being given this information?" he asked. Minyoon hesitated. This was unlike his boss. Jinwoo Park didn't notice people. He noticed territories, profit margins, threats, and opportunities. He didn't ask questions about street vendors. "You stared at her for 12 seconds through the car window, sir. You never stare at anything. I assumed you wanted to know if she was a threat." "Is she?" "Not even remotely." Jinwoo dismissed him with a gesture. But he didn't remove the folder from his desk. He found himself opening it again at midnight. 3 a.m. 5 in the morning. Amara Johnson. The name sounded like a song he'd never heard, but somehow already knew by heart. 3 weeks later, Amara's life intersected with his in a way that seemed almost engineered by fate. She was working her cart on a night when a rival gang, the Red Dragon faction, decided to make a statement about territorial boundaries. They didn't target Amara specifically. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, standing beside a noodle stand where one of Jinwoo's lieutenants had been taking a quiet dinner break. The beating was brutal and swift. Amara had tried to help, had screamed for police, had even attempted to get between the attackers and their target. That's when one of them shoved her against her cart so hard she cracked 2 ribs. By the time the red dragon scattered, Amara was on the ground, gasping, and Jim was unconscious. Jinwoo arrived 17 minutes later. He didn't see the chaos or the scattered food or the gathering crowd of concerned vendors. He only saw her. On her knees, her hands shaking as she tried to get the unconscious man to wake up. Tears streaming down her beautiful face because she believed she'd failed to save him. She hadn't seen him yet. Her eyes were fixed on the injured man. When she finally looked up, her breath caught. A man in a pristine black suit stood at the edge of the market's shadow. His posture relaxed, but his presence somehow commanding every molecule of air around him. His features were sharp. A sculpted jawline, dark intense eyes, the kind of face that belonged in boardrooms and danger in equal measure. He looked at her like he'd been waiting his entire life to see her exactly like this. "Are you hurt?" His English was flawless, his voice smooth as dark chocolate and twice as dangerous. "Your friend needs medical attention," Amara said, her voice shaky but steady. She was exhausted, scared, and her ribs screamed, but she didn't mention it. "He'll be fine." "Are you hurt?" She wasn't sure why she lied. "No." His eyes traced her face carefully, as if he could see through her skin to the damage beneath. "What's your name?" "Amara." He said it like a prayer, like it meant something sacred. "I'm Jinwoo. And Amara, the men who did this won't come near Myeongdong again. I'm going to make sure of that." She should have been afraid. Every instinct told her to run from this man whose presence felt like standing too close to a controlled fire. Instead she asked, "Who are you?" "Someone," he said quietly, "who just became very interested in knowing everything about you." After that night, Amara started noticing things. A man who always sat at the far end of the market, sipping tea he never finished, whose eyes moved constantly. A black car that appeared whenever she left her apartment at odd hours. Once, when a drunk businessman got aggressive near her cart, 3 security guards materialized from nowhere, de-escalating with professional efficiency before disappearing like ghosts. She wasn't stupid. She understood that someone was watching her. What she didn't understand was why it felt like the safest she'd ever been in her entire life. 2 weeks after the attack, she was closing her cart when a messenger appeared with a small package. Inside, wrapped in expensive tissue, was a platinum bracelet. Delicate, minimalist, and engraved with a single Korean character, Og. Park. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The next time Jinwoo appeared, walking through her market at dusk, wearing that same black suit like armor, she confronted him directly. "What is this?" She held up the bracelet, her voice low so customers wouldn't hear. "What do you want from me?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Something expensive and controlled. Close enough that his intensity became almost physical. "I want to make sure you're safe," he said simply. "I want to make sure nobody ever makes the mistake of hurting you again. And I want the chance to know you, Amara Johnson, the woman who helps strangers even when it costs her." "That's not how this works," she whispered. "You can't just own someone. Put a mark on them like their property." "Watch me," he said. And there was no threat in it. Only certainty. The bracelet isn't a mark of ownership. It's a declaration of protection. Everyone who matters in soul will understand. You're under my care. That means you're untouchable. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs all over again. "And what do you expect in return?" He smiled then, and it transformed his entire face. It made him look dangerous and breathtaking in equal measure. "Time," he said. "Honesty. Your presence. For now, that's all I'm asking. I'm a patient man, Amara. I've waited my whole life for something worth waiting for. I can wait a little longer for you to understand that we're already connected, whether you're ready to admit it or not." He reached out and touched the bracelet on her wrist, his fingers lingering against her skin. It was the first time he'd touched her intentionally, and every nerve in her body sang in response. "Wear it always," he whispered. "It's the only thing standing between you and a world that would use someone like you without hesitation. It's the only thing that makes me sleep at night knowing you're out there, working in the street, vulnerable to men far less civilized than me." "You sound insane," she breathed. I'm obsessed, he corrected. That's a very different thing. For 8 months, they existed in this strange space between protection and something neither of them could quite name. Jinwoo appeared randomly. At the market with expensive coffee and surprising gentleness. At a restaurant where she'd mentioned she wanted to eat. Waiting outside her apartment building on nights when he'd heard through his network that she was struggling. He never pushed for more than she could give, but his presence was undeniable. His loyalty was absolute. Amara tried to maintain her independence, but it was becoming harder. She couldn't help noticing the way he looked at her. Like she mattered more than his empire. Like she was the most important piece on a board where he commanded everything else. She met some of his world. Carefully. Selectively. Minjun explained that Jinwoo Park ran various enterprises and had significant interests throughout Seoul. That was corporate speak for Mafia boss, but Amara had known that from the beginning. She'd just chosen to see the other side. The side that protected vulnerable people, that created loyalty, that somehow found tenderness within ruthlessness. She fell in love with him without meaning to. And then, on that Thursday night in month 9, everything exploded into violence. The shooters came for her specifically because she was the weakest link in Jinwoo's world. The one person he cared about. The one he would sacrifice everything to save. They didn't expect him to be even more willing to sacrifice everyone else. Because trust me, the moment Amara hits that pavement, everything changes. Jinwoo Park stops being careful. He stops pretending he's still in control of his world. The underworld is about to learn exactly how far a man will go for the woman who's already marked as his. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Amara's apartment in Itaewon as her alarm went off at 4:47 a.m. She didn't snooze. She never did. There was too much to do, too many hours to squeeze into a single day. Too many dreams waiting on the other side of exhaustion. The apartment was small. Barely more than a closet with a window, but it was hers. She'd saved for 8 months to put down the deposit, working double shifts, forgoing meals sometimes, sending money to her cousin Marcus back in Atlanta, while still managing to accumulate the 3 million won she'd needed. Now, as the Seoul morning awakened around her, she moved through her pre-dawn routine with the precision of someone who had choreographed every minute of her life. Shower. Cold water because hot water cost extra. A decision that had become habit even when she could have afforded warm. Coffee made with the cheap instant grounds she bought in bulk from a convenience store. Nothing like the specialty blends the wealthy people of Seoul consumed without thinking about it. The same worn jeans she'd owned since Georgia, faded to the color of memory. A fresh apron that she'd hand-sewn over the weekend with burgundy fabric she'd found at a market in Myeongdong, sitting down with needle and thread during the 2 hours she'd allowed herself for rest. The work had been meticulous, small stitches, reinforced seams, embroidered pockets that would hold her notepad and pen. These were the things that mattered when you were building a life on margins. These were the details that said you cared about your craft. She twisted her natural curls into a style that would hold through the day without breaking apart, securing them with bobby pins that had lost their grip weeks ago but still managed to do the job. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above her sink, the mirror that had come with the apartment, and that had never been cleaned properly, she saw dark eyes reflecting back determination and ambition, but also something else. A faint shadow of homesickness she never quite managed to shake, no matter how much time passed. It was the look of someone who'd left everything behind with the hope of building something better, and who was slowly coming to understand that better was more complicated than she'd expected. At 26, Amara had already learned more about resilience than most people learned in a lifetime. She'd watched her mother work 3 jobs in Atlanta, morning shift at a hospital starting at 5 a.m., afternoon shift at a hotel from noon to 6, night shift cleaning offices from 8 in the evening until midnight, and still come home to make dinner for 2 kids who were always hungry. She'd helped raise her younger cousin Marcus when her aunt had spiraled into addiction, taking him to school at 7:30 a.m., helping with homework at the dining room table after she'd gotten home from her own part-time job, working part-time at a restaurant to put money in the household, because her mother's 3 jobs never quite stretched far enough. She'd put herself through junior college while maintaining a GPA high enough to qualify for one scholarship that covered half the costs, which meant she'd spent her evenings studying while working, and her mornings commuting between school and job sites. And when those opportunities had stalled, when the small restaurant where she'd been working had shut down during the economic recession, when Atlanta had started feeling like a place where her dreams had already been decided by others, where the system had already decided her trajectory, she'd made the terrifying decision to leave everything she knew. She'd applied for a visa to South Korea, she'd saved $7,000 in cash, and she'd gotten on a plane to a country where she didn't speak the language and didn't know a single person. Coming to Seoul 2 years ago had felt like running towards something rather than away, though sometimes she wasn't entirely sure which it was. The city had been overwhelming at first. 14 million people moving through streets that were simultaneously elegant and chaotic, buildings that touched clouds, food that tasted like nothing she'd ever experienced, a language that her American ears struggled to parse. She'd worked at tourist restaurants first because those would hire foreigners, then at cafes. Then, when she'd saved enough money and accumulated enough courage, she'd bought her cart and begun her real work. The dream had been simple in concept but massive in scope. Establish herself, save aggressively, open a legitimate business. A cafe of her own where she could employ people and create opportunity, where she could build something that mattered beyond the temporary income stream of a street cart. The street cart took her 40 minutes to prepare every single morning without fail. She owned it now, another achievement that still made her heart swell when she looked at it, even after 9 months of ownership. The burgundy paint she'd carefully applied herself, one coat at a time, over the course of 3 weekends, testing different shades until she found the exact color she wanted. A shade that suggested vitality without being aggressive, that suggested her presence in the market without demanding attention. The stainless steel counter she'd saved for 6 months to afford, buying it used from a vendor who'd decided to close his operation and move back to the countryside, but who'd maintained it beautifully and who'd spent an hour explaining its quirks and how to care for it properly. The gas burner that worked most days and sometimes didn't, requiring her to coax it along with the affection one might give to a temperamental pet, tapping it gently, checking the gas line, adjusting the valve with the precision of someone who'd learned its moods through repetition and failure. She cleaned every surface obsessively each morning, wiping down the stainless steel with a microfiber cloth that she'd been using for months, organizing her ingredients in containers arranged in a specific order that allowed her to work without thinking about where things were, checking that the temperature of the oil was exactly right before she began cooking, ensuring that everything was arranged in the way that would allow her to move through her work with zero wasted motion. The preparation wasn't just functional. It was ritual. It was her way of asserting control over the small universe of her cart, of ensuring that this one thing, this one part of her life that was entirely hers, was operating at peak efficiency and reflecting her values and her commitment to excellence. She set up in her usual spot in Myeongdong at 6:15 a.m., before the market truly came alive. The narrow alley where she worked was still mostly empty at that hour. Just the elderly vendors who'd been setting up for 30 years, and the occasional early morning jogger moving through Seoul's pre-dawn quiet. The smell of her Korean cooking began to waft through the alley as she started her fires, a blend of techniques she'd learned from YouTube videos and patient Korean vendors who'd taken pity on the young black woman trying to navigate Seoul's food culture. She'd asked Mrs. Park, one of her earliest regular customers, if she could apprentice informally, working alongside her to understand the complexities of authentic Korean street food. Mrs. Park had agreed with the kind expression of someone watching a lost person finally find direction. Tteokbokki, hatiak, gimbap, kimbap rolls that her regular customers swore were as good as any she could find in a proper restaurant, though Amara knew the truth. She used better ingredients, bought from a Korean supplier who'd initially been skeptical of her, but now reserved the best produce for her cart. She used better technique, refined through hundreds of repetitions and careful observation of how temperature and timing and pressure affected the final product. And she used better love. Every meal that left her cart was a small piece of her dream. Every customer who came back was proof that she belonged here, that she could build something, that her life meant something beyond survival. It was this last thing, the proof that her existence mattered, that drove her to work 18-hour days without complaint, that kept her moving forward even when her body screamed for rest. By 8 a.m., the market was alive with a rhythm that Amara had come to understand as intimately as she understood the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Office workers rushing past with their eyes down, and their minds already at their desks, consumed by the pressures of Seoul's competitive corporate environment. Students grabbing quick meals before school, their uniforms pressed and perfect, their futures already mapped out by the educational system that had decided their fates before they were old enough to protest. Elderly women who came as much for conversation as for food, sitting on the plastic stools Amara had arranged around her cart. These little islands of community in the sprawling anonymity of the city. Amara knew most of them by name, knew their orders before they asked, remembered details about their lives that made them feel seen in a way that Seoul's sprawling anonymity didn't usually allow. "Amara, my beautiful girl," Mrs. Park called out one morning. One of her regular customers, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a bad hip that made her walk with a careful, measured pace. "The usual, yes? But not too spicy today. My stomach has been troublesome." "Always for you, Mrs. Park." Amara smiled and began preparing the order with even more attention than usual. Mild tteokbokki, extra ginger for digestion, less spice because of Mrs. Park's stomach troubles. She added a few more pieces of vegetable than she normally would. A small act of kindness that no one would pay her extra for. The kind of customization that most street vendors didn't bother with, but that Amara understood was the difference between a transaction and a relationship. Mrs. Park had taken her under her wing when she first arrived in Seoul, had taught her basic Korean, had introduced her to the other vendors and vouched for her trustworthiness. In return, Amara made sure Mrs. Park never went without, that her meals were always prepared with care, that she had someone to talk to in a city where loneliness could consume you if you weren't careful. This was her life. This was her reality. Wake up at 4:47 a.m., move through the pre-dawn with the precision of ritual. Prepare her cart, set up her ingredients, check her supplies 3 times to make sure nothing was forgotten. Serve her customers from 6:30 a.m. until 10 p.m., with only brief breaks for personal necessities. Save everyone that wasn't spent on food and rent. Attend Korean cooking classes on Tuesday and Thursday nights, learning advanced techniques from a chef who'd initially been skeptical, but had become something like a mentor. Go to sleep at 11 p.m., exhausted down to the cellular level, and do it all again the next day. The goal was simple: save enough money to open a small cafe in the next 2 years. A place with real furniture, a kitchen where she could experiment and develop her own signature dishes, perhaps even employ a few people. A legitimate business that would transform her from street vendor to entrepreneur. That was the dream that kept her moving through the long hours. The dream that made every painful blister on her feet, and every ache in her lower back, and every missed celebration back home worth it. But what Amara didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that someone had been watching her dream take shape. Someone had noticed her meticulous work, her kindness to customers even when they didn't deserve it, the way she counted everyone with careful precision, never cheating anyone despite the opportunities that presented themselves. Someone had seen her not as a street vendor, not as a young black woman working the margins of Seoul's economy, but as something far more important. Someone had decided, for reasons that would only become clear much later, that she mattered enough to warrant attention, that she mattered enough to warrant protection, and that someone was beginning to pay very close attention. The first intervention happened on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks before she'd really noticed the pattern clearly enough to mention it to anyone. Amara had stayed later than usual because she'd promised extra meals to a wedding party that had made a bulk order. The market was emptying as the evening deepened, vendors packing up their carts, the steady stream of customers drying to a trickle. She was wiping down her counter, already thinking about how good it would feel to sit down for 5 minutes, when a group of college kids appeared at the edge of the alley. They were drunk. Loud in the way that only wealthy Seoul University students could be loud, confident in their entitlement and the assumption that the world existed to accommodate them. They wore expensive casual clothes that probably cost more than Amara's entire monthly rent, and they were looking for entertainment. When they spotted her cart, they seemed to have decided that entertainment could be found there. Vendor. Give us whatever that is, one of them shouted, his Korean accented English poor but aggressive. And make it fast. We're very important people. Amara had dealt with drunk customers before. It came with the territory of street food vending. She smiled professionally and began preparing their order, working with the same care she gave to Mrs. Park's meal, because that was who she was. But as she worked, she could feel the mood shifting. The young men were getting more aggressive, beginning to make jokes in Korean that she could only partially understand, but that made the other vendors look away with the studied disinterest of people who'd learned long ago not to get involved. One of them reached across the counter and knocked over a container of prepared gimbap. The beautiful rolls that had taken her 30 minutes to prepare, now scattered across her cart and the ground. He laughed. His friends laughed. And when Amara's face registered dismay, not anger, never anger in front of potential customers, but the confusion and disappointment of someone who just watched her work be destroyed, one of them grabbed her arm. His hand was aggressive, not yet violent but clearly moving in that direction. His fingers dug into the sensitive skin near her wrist, and she could feel the intention in his grip. This was a test, she realized. He was testing to see how much he could get away with, how much this foreign woman working the streets would tolerate. She was preparing to yell, to make a scene, to do whatever it took to get away, when a black sedan pulled into the narrow alley. It shouldn't have been able to fit. Seoul's market alleys were designed for foot traffic and small vendor carts, not for vehicles. The alley where she worked was barely wider than the sedan itself, hemmed in on both sides by the buildings and other vendors' carts. But this vehicle maneuvered with impossible precision, its driver clearly understanding exactly how much clearance existed and how to use it. The sedan pulled in slowly, methodically, parking directly between Amara and the group of troublemakers in a way that seemed absolutely intentional. The back window rolled down. A man in an expensive black suit sat in the shadows, his face not entirely visible, but his presence undeniable. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. His expression, what little she could see of it in the dim light, conveyed a message that transcended language. He was communicating something primal and ancient about power, about consequences, about the consequences that would follow if these young men didn't immediately cease whatever they were attempting. The college kids released Amara's arm as if her skin had suddenly become radioactive. They muttered apologies that sounded genuine despite their inebriation, said things in rapid Korean that she couldn't parse, and they dispersed like they'd been physically thrown from the alley. They didn't run. Pride wouldn't allow that, but their pace accelerated with each step, and within 30 seconds they disappeared around the corner completely. The black sedan didn't follow them. It simply waited, engine running, until they truly disappeared and weren't about to return. Then the window rolled up with a soft whisper of electronic precision, and the vehicle pulled away as mysteriously as it had arrived, navigating the narrow alley with the same impossible precision that had brought it in. Amara stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. She'd seen the man's eyes for just a moment, dark, intense, utterly still and strangely focused. And in that moment of connection, she'd felt something shift inside her. A recognition of power. An understanding that what she'd just witnessed was not a coincidence. Then he was gone, and she was alone in the alley with the overturned gimbap scattered across her cart, and a sense of unreality, so profound that she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. She called Marcus that night. Her cousin was 3 hours ahead in Atlanta, already transitioning between his shift at the convenience store and his night classes at community college. "You're telling me a mystery man showed up in a fancy car and scared off some drunk kids?" Marcus asked, and she could hear the skepticism in his voice, but also the underlying concern that had always been there since they were kids. "Amara, this is Seoul. Sometimes people mind their business. Could have been a coincidence." "It wasn't a coincidence," she said, but she wasn't entirely sure. And she didn't mention it to anyone else. What would she even say? That a stranger had saved her from mild harassment? That she'd felt something in that moment that she couldn't quite name? That for just an instant, she'd been aware of being protected by someone she didn't know, and that awareness had felt like both sanctuary and danger? The second intervention came 2 weeks later, In mid-November, when Seoul's weather had shifted into that peculiar coldness that made the breath visible and the streets harder, the Myeongdong market wasn't the safest place at night. Amara knew this. She'd been warned repeatedly by other vendors to leave before sunset, to not work late, to avoid the areas that became darker and more dangerous as the evening deepened. There was street crime, nothing organized, but the opportunistic kind that preyed on vulnerable people alone, people who didn't have protection. But she had bills to pay, dreams to finance, and a work ethic that didn't recognize the concept of early enough. So on a Wednesday night in early December, she was still setting up, still preparing for the evening crowd, working to extend her profit margins in the way that only aggressive hustle could accomplish. The man who approached her was large and aggressive, his posture telegraphing his intentions before his words did. He ordered food with the tone of someone used to having his demands met without question. Amara prepared the meal, and when he asked the price, she quoted her standard rate. He didn't pay. Instead, he demanded more food. When Amara politely insisted on payment first, "I have a policy for everyone," his demeanor shifted with the speed of a switch being flipped. Friendly became hostile. Casual became threatening. He started shouting, making a scene, drawing the kind of attention that made the nearby vendors look away with the studied disinterest of people who'd learned long ago not to get involved in other people's problems. Street vendors lived by a code of non-interference. You didn't call the police. You didn't get involved in other people's conflicts. You protected your own business and let everyone else handle their own situations. It was survival. Then a delivery truck pulled up, completely blocking the market corridor, making it impossible for customers to pass, creating a barrier between the troublemaker and Amara. Two men emerged wearing delivery company uniforms and began unloading boxes with mechanical precision, moving with a practiced efficiency that suggested this was routine. The troublemaker, realizing he'd lost his audience and his opportunity in the chaos of the delivery, cursed and walked away. The delivery had no name on it, no company logo that she recognized. The men worked with absolute focus, completely indifferent to the fact that they'd disrupted the entire market's evening commerce. The delivery truck waited exactly 3 minutes, long enough for the aggressor to be truly gone, to have time to move far enough away that he wouldn't return, before repacking everything and driving away. They didn't deliver anything. They didn't pick anything up. They simply appeared, accomplished their purpose, and vanished like ghosts. Amara stood in her cart, confused and unsettled. She recognized the pattern now. The black sedan. The delivery truck. These weren't coincidences. These were interventions. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with the black sedan from 3 weeks earlier, with the man whose eyes she'd seen for just a moment. That night, after she'd closed her cart and walked back to her apartment through Seoul's cold streets, she found a coffee voucher pressed under her door. From a cafe she'd mentioned to a customer once, weeks ago. A place she'd wanted to try but couldn't afford. The kind of expensive specialty coffee shop that catered to Seoul's wealthy. The voucher had no sender's name, no note. Just the voucher and the unsettling knowledge that someone had been close enough to her apartment to slide it under her door. Someone who knew her address. Someone who'd been listening when she'd mentioned a cafe she wanted to visit. She didn't use the voucher immediately. It sat on her small kitchen table for 2 days while she tried to process the implications. On the third day, exhausted and desperate for something that wasn't instant coffee, she went to the cafe. The staff knew her name before she introduced herself. They served her the most beautiful cappuccino she'd ever seen, made with a precision that suggested the coffee was treated as art rather than beverage. The voucher covered not just that drink, but 5 more visits. The third intervention was what finally made Amara understand that something larger, something systematized, was happening. It was a Friday, and the market was crowded with weekend shoppers preparing their meals for the next few days, filling the alley with the organized chaos of people trying to accomplish things before the week ended. A woman in expensive clothes, too expensive for Seoul's street markets, too attention-getting for someone who wanted to blend in, approached Amara's cart and ordered food. But instead of eating it, she sat at the small plastic stool Amara kept for customers and began asking questions with the methodical precision of someone conducting an interview. How long have you had this cart? 9 months, Amara answered, already uncomfortable with the woman's intensity. The way her eyes seemed to be cataloging information rather than making simple conversation. Do you own it? Yes. And you work alone? Most days. The woman studied her with an analytical gaze that felt clinical, professional, like she was being evaluated for something. You're very efficient. I've been watching for 20 minutes. Your waste is minimal. Your customer service is exceptional. Your prices are competitive, but not undercutting the market. You're either very smart or very desperate. Sometimes both. Is there a point to this? Amara asked, her unease growing with each answer. The woman smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who understood power dynamics and was content to let others know she understood them. The point is that you're caught between worlds, and that makes you vulnerable. There are people in Seoul who prey on people like you. People without connections, without protection, without understanding of how the city really works. People who are easy targets because they don't know the rules. And who are you? Amara's voice was quieter now, wary. Someone who works for someone who's noticed you, the woman said. She stood up, leaving payment for the food on the counter, more than the meal cost, a gesture that somehow felt like compensation for her questions rather than gratitude for the food. Be careful, Amara Johnson. Seoul is beautiful, but it has teeth. And it especially has teeth for young women working alone, too far from their families, too far from anyone who might miss them if something happened. She walked away before Amara could respond, disappearing into the crowd with the ease of someone completely comfortable in chaos. She moved like someone trained, like someone used to extracting information, and then vanishing without leaving traces. Amara stood frozen, watching the spot where the woman had been, trying to process what had just happened. That was the moment when Amara knew with absolute certainty. Someone was watching her. Someone with resources, with organization, with the kind of power that could make black sedans appear in impossible places and delivery trucks materialize to create diversions and women in expensive clothes show up to deliver cryptic warnings. And she had absolutely no idea who or why or what any of it meant. The only thing she understood was that whoever was doing this wasn't doing it to hurt her. They were doing it to protect her. And she needed to understand why. By the 4th week of these strange interventions, Amara had stopped trying to convince herself it was coincidence. She'd started noticing patterns with the kind of analytical precision that came from working with numbers every day. The man at the far end of the market who always ordered the same thing, a simple Korean rice bowl, nothing fancy, and never finished it. His eyes moved constantly, tracking the crowd, watching her. The woman who walked past her cart at exactly 7:47 p.m. Every evening, her presence somehow protective, her pace suggesting someone making a casual patrol. The security camera that had appeared on the building across from her regular spot, its angle pointed directly at her cart, recording everything that happened. She was being protected, and with increasing clarity, she understood that whoever was organizing this protection was serious about it. This wasn't amateur. This was organized. This was professional. And this was exactly the kind of thing that happened when someone important decided you mattered enough to keep safe. She needed to understand why. The opportunity came on an evening in mid-December when Amara was restocking her cart, working later than usual because she'd promised extra meals to a wedding party. They'd ordered enough food to keep her working an extra 2 hours, and the other vendors had already packed up and left. The alley was quiet, lit by the neon glow of the market signs and the thin glow of her cart's lights. She was counting the money from the day, organizing bills into piles, checking her math 3 times to make sure she'd calculated correctly, planning how much of this money would go to food and supplies and how much would go into her savings account, when a man approached. He wasn't the intimidating stranger from the black sedan. This was someone younger, with kind eyes and an apologetic expression that somehow made her more nervous rather than less. If the first man represented power, this one represented the infrastructure of power. This was someone used to delivering messages on behalf of more important people, someone who'd been trained to handle difficult situations with professionalism and restraint. "Excuse me," he said in Korean accented English, his tone suggesting he'd rehearsed this conversation many times. I'm Min-yoon. I work for someone who's taken an interest in your well-being. Amara's first instinct was to be angry. Tell your boss to back off. I understand your frustration, Min-jun said calmly, his tone suggesting he'd been trained to handle resistance without being bothered by it. But I'm here to deliver a message and an invitation. My employer would like to meet with you. Tomorrow evening. There's a restaurant in Gangnam, very private, very secure. He'd like to discuss his intentions regarding your protection. His intentions? Amara's voice rose, echoing through the empty market. I didn't ask for protection. I didn't ask for any of this. Tell him. She stopped, realizing she didn't know what to tell him. Anger, fear, and curiosity were all warring inside her, each one demanding to be heard. Why? Why would anyone care about protecting me? Min-jun tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that reminded her of the woman from before. That's a question only he can answer. But I will say this. You're too valuable to leave vulnerable. Seoul is not a safe place for someone like you, unconnected and alone. My employer is offering you something that most people would kill for. He's offering you to be untouchable. I don't want to be untouchable, Amara said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were a lie. Every person in Seoul wanted to be untouchable. Every person with dreams wanted protection. Every vulnerable person wanted someone strong enough to make them matter, to make them safe, to make the world bend to their survival. What if I refuse? Then you refuse, Min-jun said, and he sounded almost sad about it. But he won't stop watching. He won't stop protecting you. He just won't have your permission to do it. Wouldn't you prefer to know the face of the man who's already decided to change your life? He handed her a card, simple, expensive, with an address in Gangnam and nothing else. No name, no title, just a location and an implied promise that changed everything about the situation. Tomorrow at 8 p.m., Min-jun said. He'll be there. He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps fading into the Seoul night, leaving Amara standing alone in her empty market with a card in her hand that felt heavier than any object had a right to feel. That night, Amara didn't sleep. She sat in her tiny apartment, the card on her small kitchen table, and tried to process what was happening. She wasn't a fool. She understood the implications. The kind of man who could make delivery trucks disappear and security cameras appear, and expensive women deliver warnings wasn't someone running a legitimate business. The kind of protection he was offering came with strings, with obligations, with entry into a world she didn't understand and probably didn't want to understand. But she also understood that something fundamental had changed. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just a street vendor scratching out a living on the margins of Seoul's economy. Someone important had noticed her. Someone powerful wanted her attention. And every instinct in her body told her that refusing was not really an option. Not if she wanted to understand what was happening. Not if she wanted agency in her own story. At 7:30 p.m. the next evening, Amara found herself dressed in the nicest clothes she owned. A simple black dress that she'd saved for special occasions, paid 300,000 won for at a department store sale, paired with a cardigan and flat shoes because she wasn't going to meet a mysterious crime boss in heels where she couldn't run if necessary. She'd imagined 100 different scenarios about what this meeting would be like, and none of them had prepared her for the reality. The restaurant was in a building that didn't announce itself. Sleek glass and steel, discreet to the point of invisibility, the kind of place where wealthy people did business without drawing attention from the public. She was led upstairs by security that was so well trained she barely noticed them, just the subtle presence of capable people managing the space. Down a corridor that seemed designed to be anonymous, no identifying markers, no indications of where she was. And into a private room where a man sat at a table set for two. It was him. The man from the black sedan. The presence she'd felt but never quite seen clearly until this moment, now fully visible and more intense than she'd imagined possible. He wore a black suit, perfectly tailored with precision that suggested someone who understood how clothing communicated power. A white shirt beneath, No tie because ties were for people who needed the uniform of corporate hierarchy. A watch that was so expensive and understated that most people wouldn't recognize its value. His features were sharp. A sculpted jawline that looked like it had been designed by an artist specifically to communicate control. Intense dark eyes that seemed to see through the walls she'd built around herself. And an expression that was absolutely still and unreadable. He was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "Thank you for coming, Amara," he said in English, his accent exactly like the one she'd heard from the car window, precise and controlled. "I'm Jinwoo Park. I apologize for the unconventional introduction to my interest in you. Subtlety isn't always possible in my line of work." Amara sat down across from him. Because what else could she do? "Why am I here?" "Because I've been watching you for 3 months, he said simply, as if this wasn't completely insane. As if he was discussing a normal business arrangement. "Because I've observed the way you treat people. The respect you have for yourself and for others. Because I've noticed that Seoul is slowly eating you alive, and I have the capacity to prevent that. And because something about you has made me deeply uncomfortable in a way I haven't experienced in 15 years. Uncomfortable. Amara leaned back, her mind racing. "You mean like regular uncomfortable? Or like psychologically disturbing uncomfortable?" "The second one," he said, and for the first time his expression shifted. A slight smile. "You make me feel. You make me want things beyond power and territory and control. You make me want to protect someone other than my organization. And that's dangerous for a man in my position. But it's also irresistible." The meal that followed was surreal in a way that nothing in Amara's life had prepared her for. They talked about Seoul and its impossible complexity, about Atlanta and what it meant to come from a place you loved but couldn't stay in, about her dreams and his empire, about what it meant to survive in worlds where everything was struggle. He was charming in a way that suggested he'd been trained in manipulation, but was choosing not to use those skills with her. He was dangerous in a way that suggested violence was always an option but rarely necessary. He was impossibly intense. Focused on her with a concentration that made her feel like she was the only important thing in his world. By the time dessert arrived, something beautiful and expensive that she couldn't identify, but that tasted like honey and danger, Amara understood that she'd just experienced something that would alter the trajectory of her life. He'd given her information about himself carefully, strategically, revealing just enough to establish his power without overwhelming her with details. He'd asked her questions about her life that suggested he already knew the answers, but wanted to hear them from her mouth. By the time they'd finished eating, they'd moved from interrogation to something that might have been conversation if they existed in a normal world. "I'm going to protect you," Jinwoo said as the evening wound down, his voice quiet in a way that made it more dangerous. "You don't have to accept this. You can walk away. You can refuse my help, refuse my interest, refuse everything I'm offering. But I won't be able to stop myself from ensuring your safety, from removing obstacles from your path, from making sure that the city understands. You're untouchable. You're mine to protect. And what do you want in return?" Amara asked because there was always a price. Nothing in life was free. No one offered protection without expecting something in exchange. "Time," he said. "Your honesty. Your presence. And eventually, if you'll give it to me, your trust." She didn't say yes. But she didn't say no either. And when he had Minjun drive her back to Itaewon through Seoul's winter night, she found herself wearing a bracelet that hadn't been there before. Delicate platinum with a character engraved on the back. His family name. Park. A mark of protection. Or a mark of possession. She still hadn't decided which. And by the time she reached her small apartment and lay down on her thin mattress, she was already falling asleep wondering if it mattered. The shifts in Amara's life after that meeting were subtle but undeniable. Security appeared at her cart more openly now. Men who looked like they'd been carved from stone took casual positions in the market, their presence making sure that no one even looked at her wrong. Suppliers began offering her better prices, probably because they'd heard from someone important that quality ingredients for her cart were a priority. The aggressive drunks and troublemakers that every street vendor dealt with simply stopped coming near her. The minor crimes that had always happened in the market, The theft, the harassment, the casual disrespect somehow didn't happen in her presence anymore. She was untouchable now. And with that untouchability came a strange new kind of loneliness. The other vendors kept their distance, not hostile but respectful in a way that felt like fear. Customers treated her differently, with deference instead of familiarity. The intimacy of the market, the sense of community that had kept her going through exhausting days, seemed to evaporate the moment Jinwoo Park claimed her as his protected person. She'd wanted protection, wanted safety, wanted her dreams to come true. Instead, she'd gotten isolation wrapped in security. The realization hit her during a quiet Tuesday morning, when Mrs. Park didn't come by for her usual meal. Amara waited, watching the market, noticing the pattern break for the first time in months. By noon, she understood that Mrs. Park was avoiding her. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear that by associating with her, by being friendly to her, Mrs. Park might attract the attention of dangerous people. Fear that Amara's protection came with collateral consequences. It made sense from a survival perspective. Seoul's underworld operated on a logic that civilian vendors understood on an instinctive level. You didn't get close to protected people. You didn't invite that scrutiny into your own life. You maintained distance, and you protected yourself by not being associated with power games you couldn't control. Amara understood this intellectually, but emotionally, it broke something inside her. She'd come to Seoul with nothing, no family, no connections, no safety net. The only thing she'd built was relationships, small connections with people like Mrs. Park that made the exhaustion feel less isolating. And now, because someone powerful had decided to protect her, she was losing those connections. She was becoming a stranger in the place that had been her refuge. That night, she called Marcus from the small phone that Jinwoo's organization had provided for her. A phone that probably had security measures that meant someone was listening to her conversations, recording every word, analyzing her emotional state. She didn't care anymore about privacy. Privacy seemed like a luxury that belonged to people without complications, people without their lives intertwined with powerful men, people without protection that came with monitoring. Amara, where have you been? Marcus demanded. I haven't heard from you in months. Are you okay? Are you safe? I'm safe, she said, and the words felt hollow even to her. I'm more safe than I've ever been in my life. I have security, Marcus. I have protection. I have someone who cares about me enough to make sure nothing bad happens to me. That doesn't sound like safety, Marcus said carefully, choosing his words like they were being weighed in a scale. That sounds like control. That sounds like someone deciding for you what your life is going to look like. You don't understand, she said. You don't understand what it's like here, alone, trying to survive. When someone offers to make your life better, to remove the fear and the struggle, to eliminate the constant anxiety of not knowing where your next meal is coming from, or whether you can afford rent, you take it. You don't question it. You just accept it because the alternative is going back to struggling. Amara. I have to go, she interrupted. I'm okay. I promise I'm okay. She hung up before he could respond, before he could force her to confront the doubts that were beginning to surface in her mind. Because the truth was, she wasn't entirely sure she was okay. She was protected, but she was also trapped. She was cared for, but she was also owned. She was building the life she'd dreamed of, but she was doing it entirely on someone else's terms. But that wasn't the only change. Jinwoo began appearing at the market himself with increasing frequency, and each time he appeared, Amara understood more about what he meant to the people around him. He didn't announce his presence. He simply appeared, moving through the crowd with the unconscious confidence of someone who'd never had to question his place in the world. Security personnel, both his own and the market's, shifted their positioning subtly when he arrived, clearing space around him the way that water parts around a stone dropped into a stream. The vendors didn't address him. They didn't offer him food or attempt conversation. They simply acknowledged his presence with a respectful distance that suggested they understood the hierarchy they occupied. Jinwoo Park was above and beyond their world. He existed on a plane of power that made casual interaction impossible. But he never treated Amara that way. When he came to her cart, he was just a man. He was just someone who wanted to spend time with her, who wanted to understand her craft, who wanted to be part of her world even as he was clearly so far above it. "You're cutting those vegetables wrong," he said one evening about 2 weeks after their meeting, appearing beside her cart with the kind of sudden presence that would have startled her if she hadn't already learned to anticipate him. "Your angle wastes the best part." She handed him the knife without thinking about it, something she wouldn't have done for anyone else. But Jinwoo was different. He was power without arrogance, authority without cruelty. He was someone whose presence felt like permission, like possibility. He worked with unexpected precision, his movements economical and professional. As she watched his hands move, confident, controlled, absolutely sure of what they were doing, she realized that this man had clearly spent time in kitchens. He'd learned from someone patient, someone who understood that food was craft. The knowledge of that, the understanding that even this dangerous man had a history, had been shaped by relationships and learning, made her heart do something complicated. "Better?" he asked, handing the knife back, and she realized she'd been staring at his hands. "Show me," she said, and he did. He taught her an angle adjustment that made her gimbap more beautiful and wasted less product. It was such a small thing. A teaching moment that probably took 3 minutes total. But by the time he left, Amara was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the soul cold, and everything to do with the realization that she was falling for this man. She tried to rationalize it. She told herself it was gratitude, that she was mistaking protection for love, that she was projecting strength and confidence onto him, and calling it romance because that's what her isolation was doing to her mind. But deep down she knew better. When Jinwoo looked at her, he saw her. Not as a vendor, not as a street worker, not as a problem to be solved. He saw her as a person worth protecting, worth investing time in, worth loving. This happened 3 more times over the next week. He'd appear randomly, without warning, with no announced intention beyond showing up. He'd help her in small ways, teaching her how to improve her technique, showing her a better way to organize her cart, explaining the nuances of Korean seasonality, and how it should affect what she prepared. He'd share brief conversations that were somehow deeper than conversations with people she'd known for years. They talked about his childhood. Vague details about a family business that had been complicated. About learning early that loyalty was currency and power was survival. They talked about her dreams, and she watched his expression harden with something that might have been determination when she mentioned wanting to open a cafe. And each time he left, he'd place a small gift on her counter. A recipe book published by a famous Korean chef, noting the passages she should study. Expensive kitchen gloves made from leather that was so soft it felt obscene, clearly from a luxury import store. A jacket she'd mentioned wanting because the Seoul winter was brutal, her thin American coat clearly insufficient for the Seoul cold. The gifts were thoughtful and specific, suggesting he remembered every detail of every conversation they'd had. She asked him one evening, working late after all the other vendors had gone, their carts packed and their day ended. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" He was washing vegetables beside her, having inserted himself into her workflow without asking permission, as if he'd always been there, as if this were something they did together every night. "This. Showing up. Helping. Giving me things. You're a mafia boss. You have an empire to run. You have organizations depending on you for leadership and strategic decisions. You have people whose lives are literally in your hands. Why spend time with a street vendor?" He paused, his hands stilling in the water. Water dripped from his fingers, and he watched the droplets fall with a concentration that suggested he was considering his answer carefully. "Because," he said slowly, "everyone else in my life wants something from me. Money, protection, power, connection, access, favor. They see me as a resource to be exploited or a threat to be managed. But you? You just want to understand why I'm here. You don't want anything from me except the answer to that question. That's rarer than you realize." She wasn't sure she believed him completely. She wasn't sure that power operated that way, that someone could just choose to do something without expecting returns. But she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he could care about her simply because she existed, without ulterior motives or strategic calculations. That night, after he'd left and she was walking back to her apartment through Seoul's winter cold, Amara realized she was falling in love with him, not with the power or the protection or the things he could give her, though those things were undeniably present and undeniably seductive, but with him, with the way he moved, like someone completely comfortable with his own physicality, never wasting motion, never displaying anything that could be interpreted as weakness. With the way he looked at her like she was the most important thing in his world. With the way he could be gentle and ruthless in the same moment, understanding both sides of human nature with equal clarity, accepting both without judgment. And that terrified her more than any threat ever could, because love for a man like this was dangerous. Love for a man like this meant entering a world she didn't understand, and probably didn't want to understand. Love for a man like this meant accepting that her life was about to become infinitely more complicated than anything she'd previously experienced. But that wasn't the only change. Jinwoo began appearing at the market himself. Not in the black sedan that would draw attention. Not in the expensive suits that would make him stand out. He'd arrive in simple clothes, moving through the crowd like he belonged, and he'd stop at her cart. He never ordered food. He'd just stand there, watching her work, and she'd feel his eyes on her with an intensity that made every nerve ending sing in response. "You're cutting those vegetables wrong," he said one evening, his voice low so only she could hear. "Your angle wastes the best part." She handed him the knife without thinking about it. He worked with unexpected precision, his movements economical and professional. As she watched his hands move, confident, controlled, absolutely sure of what they were doing, she realized that this man, this terrifying crime boss who commanded an underworld empire, had clearly spent time in kitchens. He'd learned from someone patient, someone who understood that food was craft. "Better?" he asked, handing the knife back. "Show me," she said, and he did. He taught her an angle adjustment that made her gimbap more beautiful and wasted less product. By the time he left, Amara was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the realization that she was falling for this man. This happened 3 more times over the next week. He'd appear randomly, without warning, with no announced intention. He'd help her in small ways, teaching her how to improve her technique, showing her a better way to organize her cart, explaining the nuances of Korean seasonality, and how it should affect what she prepared. He'd share brief conversations that were somehow deeper than conversations with people she'd known for years. And each time he left, he'd place a small gift on her counter. A recipe book published by a famous Korean chef. Expensive kitchen gloves made from leather that was so soft it felt obscene. A jacket she'd mentioned wanting because the Seoul winter was brutal, her thin American coat clearly insufficient for the Seoul cold. She asked him one evening, working late after all the other vendors had gone, "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" He was washing vegetables beside her, having inserted himself into her workflow without asking permission, as if he'd always been there. "This. Showing up. Helping. Giving me things. You're a mafia boss. You have an empire to run. You have organizations depending on you for leadership and strategic decisions. Why spend time with a street vendor?" He paused, his hands stilling in the water. "Because," he said slowly, "everyone else in my life wants something from me. Money, protection, power, connection, access. But you? You just want to understand why I'm here. You don't want anything from me except the answer to that question. That's rarer than you realize." That night, after he'd left and she was walking back to her apartment through Seoul's winter cold, Amara realized she was falling in love with him. Not with the power or the protection or the things he could give her, but with him, with the way he moved, like someone completely comfortable with his own physicality. With the way he looked at her like she was the most important thing in his world. With the way he could be gentle and ruthless in the same moment, understanding both sides of human nature with equal clarity. And that terrified her more than any threat ever could. Because love for a man like this was dangerous. Love for a man like this meant entering a world she didn't understand. Love for a man like this meant accepting that her life was about to become infinitely more complicated. It was exactly 2 months after their first meeting when everything changed. The warning came from Minjun, who appeared at her cart one morning with an unusual urgency that made her stomach tighten. We need to increase security, he said quietly, standing at the counter but not ordering food. Rivals know who you are now. They understand that you matter to Jinwoo. How is that possible? Amara asked. I'm nobody. You're not nobody, Minjun said, and his expression was grave. You're the reason Jinwoo Park might make a mistake. You're the person who could distract him at a critical moment. You're leverage. And there are people in this city willing to bet their lives on exploiting that weakness. She didn't tell Jinwoo what Minjun had said, but she could see the shift in the way his men moved around her. They were no longer casual about their protection. They were actively watching the crowd with the tactical precision of soldiers preparing for combat, evaluating threats, moving with the discipline of people trained to respond to violence. And then a week later she felt it. A presence in the market that was different from the usual hostile energy that sometimes emerged from Seoul's underground. This was focused, calculated, professional. There were men watching her, not Jinwoo's men but someone else's. Men from a rival organization. And they were evaluating her with a kind of cold assessment that suggested they were planning something specific. The rivals had made their move. They were going to use her against Jinwoo. And Amara. Innocent, beautiful, ambitious Amara was about to become the center of a war she'd never even known existed. She realized what was about to happen in the moment before it started. The crowd was thinning as the evening deepened. The market was becoming the narrow alley where her cart sat alone and exposed, a perfect killing ground if someone wanted to make a point. She could feel the tension building like electricity in the air before a storm, a pressure that accumulated with each passing minute. Her hands stilled as she sensed the shift, and when she looked up from her work, she saw them. 3 men moving toward her with clear intention. Men with the look of hired professionals. Men with violence in their posture and murder in their eyes. Amara, move away from the cart, a familiar voice said behind her. Jinwoo had materialized from the crowd, his expression absolutely still and dangerous. But she couldn't move. Because in that moment, she understood the full scope of what it meant to be his chosen person. She understood that her presence in his life was about to make her a target. She understood that protection always came with a price, and the price was danger. The first shot came before she could fully process the thought. The sound was impossibly loud, impossibly real, echoing through the narrow alley like a physical force. Her cart exploded around her, and for a terrible moment, everything seemed to slow down. She had a flash of memory. Jinwoo's face registering something that might have been rage or might have been fear. The hands that grabbed her from behind, pulling her away from the violence. The sound of gunfire becoming a symphony of chaos. And then, in the seconds before everything descended into true violence, she understood the gravity of her situation. She'd asked for protection. She'd accepted his mark. She'd let herself fall in love. And now, the consequences of all of that were about to be written in blood and fire across the Seoul market. The moment seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Amara could hear every sound with impossible clarity. The mechanical click of guns being readied, the shuffle of feet on concrete, the breath moving in and out of her own lungs. She could smell the mixture of market food and Seoul's winter air, and something metallic that she realized was fear. Her own fear, manifesting as a physical scent, a chemical reality that preceded the violence. Jinwoo's men emerged from the crowd with military precision. They weren't mercenaries or random thugs. They were trained security operatives, soldiers of Seoul's underworld, people who dedicated their lives to the protection of someone they considered worth dying for. She watched as they positioned themselves with a speed that suggested years of practice, as if they'd run this scenario 1,000 times. "Get her out of here," Jinwoo commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with a clarity that made everything slow down even further. His eyes met Amara's for just a moment, and in that moment, she saw something raw beneath the control. She saw fear. Not fear for himself, but fear for her. And she understood that his greatest weakness, his vulnerability, was her existence in his world. Minjun grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the narrow alleyway that led away from the cart. She tried to resist, tried to stay, tried to process what was happening. But Minjun's grip was professional and unyielding. He was protecting her the way Jinwoo had asked him to protect her. The way that meant getting her away from the violence regardless of whether she consented. In the distance, she heard the first shots. Not the immediate gunfire she'd expected, but something more controlled. Suppressed weapons. Precision. Jim was organization responding to the attack with the coordination of a military operation. And as Minjun pulled her through the Seoul night, away from the market, away from the man she just realized meant more to her than anything else in her life, Amara understood something fundamental. She'd crossed a line. She'd accepted his protection. She'd accepted his mark. She'd accepted him. And now, there was no going back to being invisible. Now there was only forward, into whatever this was becoming. The weeks that followed were a strange combination of lockdown and glimpses of the war that was being fought in Seoul's shadows. Amara was kept in a secure location. A penthouse apartment in a building that didn't advertise its purpose, with security that was so thorough it felt like imprisonment. She couldn't leave without an escort. She couldn't contact anyone outside of a vetted list. She couldn't even access social media, to prevent rival organizations from tracking her location through digital means. But she could see Jinwoo. That much he'd insisted on. He came to her every evening, moving through the penthouse like he'd been there 1,000 times, like he lived there in the spaces between his dangerous meetings and his complex political calculations. He'd bring food. Not the street food from her cart, but carefully prepared meals made by people he employed specifically for that purpose. They'd eat together in the expansive kitchen that overlooked Seoul's skyline. And he'd tell her about his day in vague terms that suggested violence without specifying blood. The situation is being managed, he'd say. My people are making our position clear. She understood what that meant. People were dying. Organizations were fracturing. Power was being redistributed across Seoul's underworld. And she was the catalyst for all of it. One evening, as they sat looking out at Seoul's lights, she asked him directly, "How many people have died because of me?" "None," he said, and his voice was completely certain. People died because rival organizations made strategic miscalculations. They chose to see you as leverage, and that was their error. But they didn't die because of you, Amara. They died because of the choices they made. If I wasn't here, I'd still be at war with them, he interrupted, not unkindly. This was inevitable. They were always going to challenge my position eventually. You just accelerated the timeline. You gave me a reason to be ruthless in a way I haven't been in years. In some ways, you've made me more efficient at managing my organization. She wasn't sure if that was supposed to comfort her. She wasn't sure if anything could comfort her. She'd wanted protection. She'd wanted safety. She'd wanted her dreams to come true. But this isolation, this knowledge that people were dying because she mattered to him, this wasn't what she'd imagined. But then he'd take her hand, and she'd remember why she'd agreed to all of this. Because when Jinwoo Park looked at her, she felt like she mattered. She felt like her existence had meaning beyond survival. She felt like her dream of opening a cafe wasn't just fantasy. It was something that could actually happen, that he would make happen because she'd asked for it. "When this is over," she said one evening, "what happens to me?" "Whatever you want," he said. "I'll open that cafe for you. I'll employ whoever you want to employ. I'll make sure you have security without it feeling like imprisonment. I'll give you the life you came to Seoul to build. And what will you expect in return?" He was silent for a long moment. "Your company. Your presence. Your honesty. And eventually, the possibility that you might love me the way I'm beginning to love you." She didn't say it back that night. But she was close. She was so close to admitting that she'd already crossed that threshold. That she was already entirely his. That the only thing holding her back was fear. Fear of what that meant. Fear of what would happen if she admitted it. Fear of the reality that loving him meant entering a world that didn't have the safe boundaries she'd tried to create. By the time Amara was allowed to leave the penthouse and return to her cart, which had been completely restored and restocked by Jinwoo's people, 6 weeks had passed. 6 weeks of the war settling into something quieter, something that happened in the shadows and boardrooms rather than the streets. 6 weeks of the rival gangs deciding that challenging Jinwoo Park was more costly than backing down. She reopened on a cold February morning, and the Seoul market welcomed her back like she'd only been gone a day. The other vendors said nothing about her absence, about the security around her cart, about the way everything had changed. They simply made space for her to operate, treating her with a respect that bordered on reverence. Mrs. Park came to her cart first thing that morning. "Amara, my beautiful girl," she said, her eyes searching Amara's face for signs of trauma or damage. "I was so worried." "I'm okay," Amara said, and she realized it was true. She was okay. She was more than okay. She was untouchable. She was protected. She was loved by a man powerful enough to reshape Seoul's power structure for her. "That man who protects you," Mrs. Park said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone talking about something dangerous. "He must love you very much." Amara didn't respond. But she smiled, and Mrs. Park seemed to understand what that smile meant. That evening, when Jinwoo appeared at her cart as the market was closing, Amara knew it was time. It was time to stop protecting herself. Time to stop pretending she could maintain distance. Time to admit what she'd been denying since the moment she'd first seen his eyes in the black sedan. "I love you," she said without preamble, without warning, without any of the careful buildup that was supposed to accompany such declarations. "I'm completely, irrationally in love with you. I don't understand how this happened. I don't understand why I feel like this about a man who controls a crime empire. I don't understand any of it. But I know it's true." He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment, she thought she might have made a terrible mistake. She thought he might laugh, or dismiss her, or explain that what they had was just protection and obsession rather than actual love. Instead, he reached across the cart, and took her face in his hands with a tenderness that seemed impossible for someone so powerful. "I know," he said. "I've known for months. And I've been waiting for you to understand it too." And then, in the middle of the Myeongdong market with the Seoul night glowing around them, he kissed her. It was a kiss that felt like a promise. It was a kiss that felt like the beginning of something that neither of them fully understood, but both of them desperately wanted. It tasted like risk and possibility, and the understanding that they were about to do something irrevocable. When they broke apart, Amara understood something fundamental about herself, and about what her life had become. She'd come to Seoul to build a dream. She'd thought that dream was a cafe, a legitimate business, independence and success measured in financial terms, and the achievement of having accomplished something through her own efforts. She'd thought that dream was about proving to herself that she could survive anywhere, that she could create opportunity out of nothing, that she could be someone other than the invisible poor girl from Atlanta. But somewhere along the way, her dream had transformed into something completely different. Her dream was now a life built with this man who loved her with an intensity that matched her own. Her dream was proving that protection and love and power didn't have to be destructive forces. They could be tools for building something beautiful. Her dream was showing Seoul that someone powerful could choose to be gentle, could choose to protect someone he loved without possessing them, could choose to be better than the role he'd been born into. She was terrified by this realization. She was terrified because it meant she'd surrendered the illusion of control that she'd been clinging to. It meant that her life was no longer something she could manage through discipline and sacrifice and pure determination. It meant that she was dependent on another person, vulnerable to another person's choices, entangled with someone in a way that made her safety conditional on his feelings for her. But she was also exhilarated by it. She was exhilarated because she was no longer alone. She was exhilarated because someone saw her, not as a problem to be solved, not as a project to be managed, but as a person worth caring about. She was exhilarated because for the first time in her life, she could imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival into the territory of actual living. And as she packed up her cart that night, with Jinwoo waiting to drive her home in his black sedan, Amara realized that her life had fundamentally changed. She was no longer the invisible street vendor scratching out a living on Seoul's margins. She was no longer someone trying to build something through the force of her own will alone. She was someone's chosen person. She was someone who mattered. She was someone loved by a man dangerous enough to reshape the world for her. She was someone who was beginning to understand that power and protection and love could be the same thing when they came from the right source. Jinwoo drove in silence, one hand on the steering wheel, one hand resting on her knee. They didn't need to talk. They'd already said everything that mattered. They'd already made the fundamental agreement that they would navigate this together, that they would build something together, that they would transform each other through the sheer force of their commitment. Where are we going? She asked as the car moved through Seoul's night, away from the market district, toward somewhere unfamiliar. Somewhere safe, he said. Somewhere we can talk without being overheard. Somewhere I can begin to show you what I want to build with you. And Amara settled back against the leather seat of his car, watching the Seoul lights blur past the window, understanding that the chapters of her life she'd lived before this moment were complete. Whatever came next would be written in a completely different language. Whatever came next would be shaped by this man beside her, by the power he controlled, by the love he was offering her, by the choice she'd made to accept it all. The story of Amara Johnson, street vendor, dreamer, survivor, was ending. And the story of Amara Johnson, the woman who loved a mafia boss, who was loved in return with terrifying intensity, who was about to be transformed by the forces her own courage had set in motion, was beginning. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was everything she'd been working toward, wrapped in a package she'd never expected to receive. As the black sedan moved through Seoul's winter night, carrying her toward a future she couldn't quite imagine, Amara understood that the chapters of her life she'd lived before this moment were complete. The street vendor phase was ending. The survival phase was ending. The phase of building something alone was ending. What was beginning? The real story, the real transformation. That was only just starting. She didn't know what Jinwoo would ask of her. She didn't know what accepting his protection would ultimately cost. She didn't know if love could survive in a world where power and danger were always present, where the stakes of every decision were life and death, where one misstep could unravel everything. But she was willing to find out. She was willing to take the risk. She was willing to trust a man she barely knew, but somehow understood completely. She was willing to transform herself into whatever she needed to become to build a life with him. The Seoul lights reflected in the car's windows as Jinwoo drove, creating patterns of illumination that danced across her face. She could see his profile, the sharp jawline, the focused expression, the quiet confidence of someone used to making impossible decisions and living with the consequences. This was the man who'd decided to protect her. This was the man who'd restructured his organization around ensuring her safety. This was the man who'd looked at a street vendor in a Seoul market and seen someone worth protecting, worth loving, worth changing his entire empire for. What happens now? She asked into the silence, her voice small in the expansive space of the sedan. Now, he said, his eyes still on the road, we begin. It was such a simple answer. It was such a complete answer. It contained all the possibility and all the danger, and all the love that existed between them. It contained the understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together. It contained the promise that her life was about to become something bigger and more complicated and more meaningful than anything she'd previously experienced. And as Seoul moved past them, the market districts fading into residential neighborhoods, fading into the glittering landscape of the wealthy districts where powerful people conducted their business, Amara understood that she'd finally arrived at the life she'd been working toward. Not the cafe she'd imagined. Not the financial independence she'd dreamed about. But something deeper. Something more real. Something that would require her to be brave in ways she'd never imagined, but that would also allow her to be loved in ways she'd never thought possible. Because trust me, this is just the beginning. The real test of Amara and Jinwoo's love is about to start. The real journey, the transformation, the redemption, the possibility of two people from completely different worlds building something beautiful together. That's only just beginning. Stay with us as we watch Amara step into a world of danger and power, as we watch Jinwoo begin to question everything he's built, as we watch them navigate the spaces between protection and possession, between love and obsession, between the criminal empire Jinwoo controls, and the legitimate dreams that Amara is about to teach him to want. The story isn't over. It's barely begun. The warnings started small, subtle shifts in the texture of Seoul's underworld that only someone paying close attention would notice. A delivery that didn't arrive at Jinwoo's main operation, forcing him to reroute supplies through alternative channels. A supplier suddenly losing interest in working with her cart, making vague excuses about business changes and shifting priorities. The security personnel that had become invisible fixtures in the market began positioning themselves differently, more visibly and obviously, like they were preparing for something significant. Amara noticed because she noticed everything now. 3 months of being protected had taught her to read the signs of danger the way other people read newspapers. The sudden absence of certain people, the repositioning of security, the electricity in the air that preceded violence. She'd learned to interpret these signs through a combination of observation and Jinwoo's explanations during their evening time together. He would sit with her after her cart closed, bringing expensive coffee and sitting on the plastic stool meant for customers, and he would explain the politics of Seoul's underground in language she was slowly beginning to understand. Territory disputes, shifting alliances. The constant recalibration of power dynamics in a world where respect was measured in willingness to use violence and loyalty was the only currency that truly mattered. Minjun appeared at her cart on a Monday morning with an unusual urgency. "We need to increase security," he said quietly, standing at the counter but not ordering food, his presence somehow announcing that something had shifted. "Rivals know who you are now. They understand that you matter to Jinwoo." She'd heard variations of this warning before, but something in his tone was different. This wasn't precautionary. This was urgent. "How bad?" she asked, continuing to work but with heightened awareness. "Bad enough that he's considering whether you should leave Seoul for a while. Bad enough that every organization in the underground is reassessing their strategies. You've become a liability in his world, Amara. Which means you've also become a target." That evening, when Jinwoo arrived at her apartment, he had keys now, could come and go as he pleased, had integrated himself into her life so completely that she couldn't remember what it felt like to exist without him. She saw the shift in him too. He moved with the coiled intensity of someone preparing for war. "I want you somewhere safe," he said without preamble. "A secure location. No market. No routine. Just safety." "How long?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Until it's resolved." The attack came 3 days later. She'd convinced him to let her work one last shift. One final day at her cart before disappearing into whatever protection he'd arranged. The market was busier than usual. People stocking up before the weekend. And she was moving through her work with the precision that had become second nature. The burgundy cart was gleaming. Her ingredients were perfectly prepped. Everything was exactly as it should be. That's when she felt it. The shift in the air that comes right before violence. The sudden absence of a certain type of person in the market. The way that security personnel straightened almost imperceptibly. The way that Jinwoo, who'd been standing at the far end of the alley watching her work, tense like a predator sensing prey. She looked up from her work and saw them. 3 men approaching with the kind of purpose that only existed in professional violence. Men with the hollow eyes of people hired to do damage. Men who carried themselves with the confidence of killers. "Amara, move away from the cart," Jinwoo commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. But she couldn't move. Her body had frozen in that moment of recognition. The moment when theory became reality, when the warnings became truth, when she finally understood the full consequence of matching to him. The first shot shattered her cart's glass protective surface, sending shards of brilliant destruction across the market like deadly confetti. The impact created a sound that echoed through the alley. A violent shattering that signaled the end of the life she'd built. Amara felt the heat of the bullet pass close to her face, close enough that she could feel its presence in the air before her mind could process what was happening. Time seemed to fragment into moments that lasted forever, and happened instantly simultaneously. The second shot hit her cart's stainless steel counter, splintering the wood support structure, destroying months of careful maintenance and investment. The metal rang with the impact, a sound like a bell being struck in warning. Amara watched in slow motion as her cart, the thing she'd built with her own hands, the symbol of her independence and her survival in Seoul, began to collapse. The third shot. She felt this one clearly, a burning sensation across her left shoulder that seemed to travel through her entire body like lightning following its path through vulnerable flesh. The impact knocked her forward, and she found herself falling, tumbling toward the cold sole pavement with no way to prevent the collision. The world tilted, and she found herself on the ground, looking up at neon lights that suddenly seemed very far away. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, and at the end of that tunnel, she saw Jinwoo's face registering something that might have been rage or might have been terror, an expression of losing something precious before he could save it. She saw him moving toward her, moving through gunfire like it was rain falling around him, moving like nothing mattered anymore except reaching her, being near her, ensuring she survived. Then everything dissolved into chaos. The sound of gunfire was constant now. Not the initial shots, but the return fire from Jinwoo's organization responding with synchronized precision. She could hear shouting in Korean, the screaming of civilians fleeing, the mechanical sound of weapons being discharged. But underneath all of that, she heard Jinwoo's voice, cold and controlled, issuing orders like a general directing an army. Get her out. Now. Move her to the medical unit. No hospitals. No records. She stays with us. Anne's grabbed her. Professional, efficient, moving her away from the market into a van that smelled of antiseptic and something else. Something like war. She wanted to ask questions, wanted to understand what was happening, but her body wasn't responding to her commands anymore. There was only the burning in her shoulder, and the darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision. Stay with me, Jinwoo's voice said, and she realized he was there in the van with her, his hands pressing against her wound with focused intensity. You're going to be fine. You're going to survive this. Do you understand me? You don't get to leave. Not when I've just found you. She tried to respond, tried to tell him that she wasn't leaving, that she was going to stay, that she'd already made her choice. But words wouldn't form. There was only the sound of the van moving through Seoul streets, and the feeling of Jinwoo's presence beside her, solid and real and absolutely determined. The medical facility wasn't a hospital in any conventional sense. It was something else entirely, a private clinic that existed in Seoul's underground economy. A place where people with dangerous businesses received treatment without paperwork, without questions, without the official records that could be used against them. The facility was equipped with equipment rivaling any legitimate hospital, staffed by the finest medical professionals money could buy. Surgeons carefully selected and extensively vetted, anesthesiologists with military expertise in trauma care, nurses trained in handling the worst injuries Seoul's underworld could produce. The surgical team was professional and efficient, moving with the precision of people who'd performed this procedure countless times. Bullet wounds, hemorrhage control, arterial repair, nerve damage assessment, stabilization. They worked in coordinated silence, each person understanding their critical role, each decision made with the understanding that this patient mattered to someone extremely powerful. Amara drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments that seemed to exist in dream state. Jinwoo arguing intensely with the lead surgeon about complications, demanding constant updates, insisting every possible intervention be deployed regardless of cost. Minjun on the phone, describing the market attack with professional precision, confirming that the rival gang had been comprehensively neutralized, destroyed as a functional organization. Equipment beeping in constant rhythm, fluids being administered through multiple IVs. The machinery of underground medicine operating with military precision to keep her alive. She woke fully 3 days later in a private room that could have belonged to an upscale hospital if not for the reinforced door, security cameras, guards stationed outside, and complete absence of identifying information. The pain was a constant background noise, dull and managed by medication. Her shoulder immobilized in a sling, her entire left side feeling disconnected from her conscious mind. Her body felt simultaneously heavy and alien, like she was inhabiting a flesh suit that didn't quite belong to her anymore. Jinwoo was there, sitting in a chair beside her bed, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His face was haggard, his suit rumpled, his dark eyes carrying a weight that suggested he'd made decisions in these past 72 hours that would alter the trajectory of everything. When he saw her awake, something in his expression shifted. relief and anger, and something that might have been terror all fighting for dominance. "Don't ever do that again," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Get shot." She managed, her throat dry. "Get shot, put yourself in danger, make me feel like I was losing you." He leaned forward, taking her uninjured hand in his. "I'm reorganizing everything. No more cart in the market. No more routine. No more visibility. You're moving into the penthouse. Full security. Full protection." She should have argued. She should have fought for her independence, her dreams, her right to make her own choices. But as she looked at his face, at the raw emotion barely contained beneath the surface, she understood that fighting now would be cruel. He'd nearly lost her, and he wasn't going to allow that possibility to exist anymore. "Okay," she said simply. Recovery was slower than she expected. The bullet had done significant damage, severing nerves, tearing through muscle, leaving a wound that healed in stages and with increasing complications. The infection set in on day 8, and for 48 hours, she hovered in fever dreams where Seoul twisted around her and Jinwoo's voice kept her anchored to reality. She heard him talking to the surgeons, heard the desperation in his voice beneath the controlled facade, heard him say things that revealed exactly how much she'd come to matter to him. "Fix her," he commanded the medical team, and there was no negotiation in his voice, no acceptance of any outcome except complete recovery. "Whatever it costs, whatever you have to do. She will walk out of here completely healed. There is no alternative." But she survived. Through antibiotics and careful nursing, through Jinwoo's absolute refusal to let her give up, through the understanding that her body was recovering because her will to recover had become as important as his will to keep her alive. She survived because she understood that giving up wasn't an option. Not for someone who'd already fought this hard to build something in Seoul. Not for someone who loved this man and wanted to see what they could create together. By day 20, she could sit up, and Jinwoo would sit beside her bed, holding her hand, telling her about the organizations being dismantled, the threats being neutralized, the way Seoul's underworld was responding to the attack on her. By day 30, she could walk short distances, slowly moving through the clinic's corridors with Jinwoo supporting her, learning to use her body again with the discipline she brought to everything. By day 45, the bandages came off, revealing a scar that would mark her forever. A physical reminder of what it meant to matter to Seoul's most dangerous man. A permanent record of the day that violence and love had intersected in her life. The penthouse became her entire world during those recovery months. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Seoul's sprawl, the city that had shaped her and broken her and remade her. She rarely looked out at the city anymore. She looked inward instead. Looked at Jinwoo. Looked at the scar forming on her shoulder. Looked at what was building between them in this space of forced intimacy and vulnerability. The attack had stripped away all the remaining walls between them. There was no more pretending, no more testing boundaries. They existed in a space of complete exposure with each other. He spent his evenings with her, bringing reports from his organization, explaining the shifts that had occurred since the attack in meticulous detail. The rival gang had been decisively dealt with. Not destroyed completely, but crippled enough that they'd ceased to be a threat for generations. Jinwoo's position had been strengthened rather than weakened by the attack. Everyone in Seoul's underworld now understood with absolute clarity. You didn't target his people without facing consequences so severe that the calculation became simple math. Leave him alone or face annihilation. His people had proven that they would fight to the death for him, because he fought to the death for them. During one of these evening conversations, as Amara's shoulder began to heal and she regained strength, Jinwoo said something that changed everything between them again. "I want something different," he said, sitting beside her bed as she recovered, his expression carrying a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "I want to build something legitimate. Community projects. Housing developments. Things that actually help people instead of exploiting them. I want to use my power to create instead of destroy." She looked at him with surprise. "That doesn't sound like you. It sounds like someone who's trying to become better, because someone I love is forcing me to see that better is possible," he said simply. "You came to Seoul with nothing but a dream. You wanted to open a cafe. You wanted to build something meaningful. And then you got shot because you mattered to me. Because my world collided with yours and violence was the result. I can't change what happened. But I can change what comes next. Let me give you something to do. Let you help me transform my empire into something that actually matters. For Amara, this moment represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. She understood that Jinwoo wasn't asking her to help him become legitimate because he was afraid or because he'd suddenly discovered morality. He was offering her partnership because he'd finally understood that true power came from building rather than destroying, that the people who mattered most to him, in this case, her, mattered because they had vision and values, not because they could be controlled through fear. By month 3 of recovery, Amara was mobile enough to leave the penthouse. The first project was a community center in a neighborhood that Jinwoo's organization had historically exploited for drug distribution and loan sharking operations, extracting wealth from the most desperate residents. The building had been slated for demolition, condemned and abandoned, but Amara saw possibility in its bones. She saw a kitchen where young people could learn to cook, where the skills that had brought her survival and partial success could be passed on to others. She saw community spaces where elderly residents could gather without fear, where the loneliness that came with poverty could be interrupted by connection. She saw the future that Seoul could be if someone with power decided to use it differently, to invest in community healing instead of community extraction. Jinwoo hired the best contractors, the finest designers, and gave Amara complete creative control. She threw herself into the work with the same intensity she'd given to her street cart, but magnified now, directed toward serving hundreds instead of individual customers. Every detail mattered. Every decision was made with the understanding that this space would serve people who had historically been ignored by Seoul's privileged classes, people who were invisible, people who needed someone to see them and believe that their lives mattered. The transformation took 6 months. The building was completely renovated, not luxuriously, but with genuine care for functionality and beauty and dignity. The kitchen was equipped with professional-grade equipment that could prepare food for large community events. The computer lab was stocked with the latest technology and staffed with instructors who volunteered their time. The community spaces were designed to be welcoming, to signal that they belonged to everyone, that this wasn't charity but investment in the neighborhood's future, that people deserved respect and opportunity regardless of their economic status. By the time the community center opened, Amara's shoulder had healed completely, though the scar remained. A physical reminder of the violence that had precipitated this profound change, a mark that connected her suffering to the possibility that had emerged from it. The opening ceremony was quiet and understated, deliberately avoiding media presence or public publicity that might draw unwanted attention to Jinwoo's legitimate business operations. Just the people of the neighborhood, slowly exploring the space that had been built for them. An elderly woman standing in the professional kitchen, tears streaming down her face as she touched the countertops. Understanding that this space represented possibility, a group of teenagers looking at the computer lab with expressions of wonder, realizing that access to technology was no longer something only wealthy kids could take for granted. Families gathering in the community space, finding refuge and possibility in the structure that had been created for them. Amara watched it all unfold from a position near the kitchen, her shoulder still healing but her spirit soaring. This was what transformation looked like. This wasn't abstract. It was physical, tangible, real in the way that only concrete evidence of change could be. She'd come to Seoul with nothing but a dream to open a cafe. Now she'd opened something infinitely larger, a space of possibility for hundreds of people. Minjun approached her as she watched the people flowing through the center. "He's different now," Minjun said quietly, standing beside her. "Less ruthless. More calculated. People notice. Some see it as weakness. They're making moves in the territories, testing boundaries. But most understand it's actually the evolution of someone too intelligent to remain static. They're waiting to see if his power decreases with his shift toward legitimacy, or if he's simply becoming more subtle in how he wields it." "Is he happy?" Amara asked, the question that mattered most to her. "I think he's learning what happy means," Minjun replied. "I've worked with him for 7 years. I've never seen him like this. He smiles now. He makes jokes. He talks about building instead of destroying. It's unusual. It's beautiful, actually. The next projects came in succession, each one carefully planned and executed with the precision that characterized all of Jinwoo and Amara's collaborative work. A women's shelter in the Itaewon district that provided safe housing and support services for women escaping violent situations, designed with input from social workers and the women themselves who had lived through domestic violence and human trafficking. A youth education center in Gangnam that offered free tutoring and career counseling to teenagers from low-income families, creating pathways to opportunity that had previously been closed to them. A housing cooperative that provided affordable residences in areas that had been systematically abandoned by legitimate developers, using innovative financing models that Jinwoo's business expertise allowed them to pioneer. Each project carried Amara's fingerprints, the subtle signatures of someone who understood poverty not as an abstract concept, but as lived experience. Each project reflected her vision of what Seoul could be if someone with power decided to invest in community healing rather than community exploitation. The women's shelter had communal kitchens because Amara understood that cooking together created bonds and healing. The youth center had art spaces because she knew that creative expression was therapeutic. The housing cooperative had community gardens because she'd lived on streets and understood the human need for beauty and growing things. And with each project, Jinwoo's empire began its slow, deliberate transformation. Money that had come from violence and exploitation now came from legitimate business investments, real estate development, hospitality ventures, technology startups that Jinwoo's organization carefully vetted and partially funded. The organization that had operated in shadows began operating in daylight, maintaining power through influence and reputation rather than fear. It wasn't a complete transformation. He still maintained connections to his darker operations, still made decisions that existed in moral gray areas, still commanded loyalty through a combination of respect and implicit threat. But there was an undeniable shift toward legitimacy, toward building rather than destroying, toward creating opportunity rather than exploiting desperation. Amara found herself working alongside him in ways that extended far beyond their personal relationship. They made decisions together about which neighborhoods needed the most intervention, which community projects would have the most impact. She brought the perspective of someone who'd lived at the margins of Seoul's economy, who understood viscerally what the poorest residents needed because she'd been one of them just months before. He brought resources, vast resources, and the ability to move systems that had seemed immobile, to make bureaucracies bend to his will through a combination of money, influence, and the implicit threat of his power. Together, they were formidable. City officials who'd never given a second thought to street vendors suddenly found themselves meeting with Amara at official events. Journalists who'd never covered community development in poor neighborhoods suddenly received invitations to tours of the centers they were building. The narrative around Seoul's poorest residents began to shift, slowly but perceptibly, from invisible to visible, from problem to resource, from people to be exploited to people to be invested in. 3 months into the community center project, Amara found herself presenting architectural renderings to municipal officials, explaining her vision in language that blended technical specifications with the emotional intelligence of someone who understood what these spaces meant to the people who would use them. She was nervous at first, presenting to rooms full of powerful people in formal business attire, feeling like an imposter despite everything she'd accomplished. But Jinwoo would sit in the back of the room, and whenever her confidence wavered, she'd catch his eye and see the absolute certainty there. Certainty that she belonged in this space, that she had earned the right to speak with authority, that her vision mattered. "You were born for this," he told her after one particularly successful presentation where the municipal government had approved expanded funding for the project. "You were born to be exactly what you are now. The street vendor phase wasn't your destiny. It was your training ground. Now you're using everything you learned there to help thousands of people." "I was happy selling food though," she said, sitting in his office after the presentation, still wearing the professional blazer and slacks that now comprised half her wardrobe. "I was doing something real. Something tangible." "You're still doing something real," he said. "It's just on a larger scale now." You're teaching people to fish instead of giving them fish. You're creating systems instead of just feeding individual hunger. That's real too. That's actually more real because it addresses root causes instead of just symptoms. One evening, 9 months after the attack that had nearly killed her, Amara stood in Jim's office, an expansive space on the 42nd floor of a building that carried his family name, and looked at the architectural renderings for their next project. A comprehensive cafe and food business incubator that would help young entrepreneurs like she had been get their start without having to sacrifice their health and safety on Seoul's streets. You know what this is? Jinwoo said, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding the small of her back with the unconscious familiarity of someone who'd integrated her into his world so completely that touching her felt as natural as breathing. What? She asked. Your original dream, he said. The cafe you wanted to open. Except now it's not just for you. It's for everyone. It's for every young person in Seoul who has ambitions but not resources, who has dreams but not safety. She turned to look at him, this man who'd started as her protector and become her partner, her love, the person who'd taught her that transformation wasn't theoretical, it was possible. It was daily. It was choosing to be better, choosing to build instead of destroy, choosing to love instead of control. I love you, she said simply. I need you to know that, in case anything ever happens. In case the world tries to separate us. I love you. He kissed her then, there in his office overlooking Seoul's sprawl, in the space where he'd once ruled through fear and now ruled through the respect that came from genuine change. It was a kiss that felt like a contract. A promise that they would continue building together, transforming Seoul one project at a time, proving that love and power didn't have to be destructive forces. The occasional threat still came. There were people in Seoul's underworld who saw Jinwoo's transformation as weakness, who thought they could exploit his move toward legitimacy to reclaim territory he'd relinquished. But Jinwoo had learned something crucial from his time with Amara. True power wasn't about domination, it was about the loyalty of people who chose to follow you because they believed in your vision. His people stayed. Not from fear, but from respect. Not from obligation, but from the understanding that they were building something that mattered, that extended beyond traditional organized crime into something closer to legitimate business with community impact. 6 months after the cafe incubator opened, 3 young entrepreneurs had graduated from the program and opened their own restaurants. One of them, a woman named Jiwoo who'd been working a similar cart to Amara's, cried when Amara came to the opening of her restaurant. I wouldn't be here without what you did, Jiwoo said. I wouldn't have believed it was possible. Amara understood then what Jinwoo had understood months before. Transformation wasn't just about changing yourself. It was about creating the conditions for others to change. It was about using power to build rather than destroy, to create opportunity rather than exploit desperation. One evening, as they sat in their penthouse overlooking Seoul, Amara in Jinwoo's arms, both of them processing the day's decisions and victories, she asked him something she'd been wondering for months. Do you regret it? Leaving the purely criminal side of your business? Becoming someone more legitimate? He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I regret the years I spent not knowing that this was possible, he finally said. I regret every person I hurt when I was operating from a place of fear and control. But do I regret who I'm becoming because of you? No. I regret nothing about that. Even when the old organizations challenge you. Even when you have to choose between what's profitable and what's right. Especially then, he said. Because I'm choosing based on something other than fear for the first time in my life. And that's worth every bit of the profit I'm sacrificing. By year 2, the transformation was complete enough that even the most skeptical observers in Seoul's underground had to acknowledge it. Jinwoo Park had become something new. Not exactly legitimate, not exactly criminal, but existing in a space where both worlds intersected. He maintained enough connection to organized crime to remain relevant, but he'd directed so much energy toward legitimate business and community development that his actual criminal operations had shrunk to a fraction of what they'd once been. More importantly, he was happy. Not in the explosive, adrenaline-fueled way that violence and domination had made him happy, but in a quieter, deeper way that came from building something that mattered, from loving someone completely, from using his power for creation rather than destruction. Amara was different too. She was no longer the desperate street vendor scratching out a living in Seoul's markets. She was a businesswoman, an entrepreneur, a community developer. She sat on boards and made decisions that affected thousands of people. She spoke at conferences about her journey from the margins to the center of Seoul's economy. She used her platform to advocate for the protection of street vendors and informal workers. The people she'd been, the people she understood. But she never forgot where she came from. Every project bore the fingerprints of someone who understood poverty from the inside, who understood what it meant to be invisible, who understood that transformation required not just good intentions, but genuine commitment to change. One morning, nearly 2 years after the attack that had changed everything, Amara woke in the penthouse to find Jinwoo already awake, standing at the window looking out at Seoul. She came to stand beside him, and he pulled her close, his arm around her waist in a gesture that had become habitual. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The cart? The market? The independence of working for yourself?" She considered the question carefully. "I miss the simplicity," she said. "I miss the days when my only job was to make good food and treat people well. But I don't miss the desperation. I don't miss wondering how I'd pay rent. I don't miss feeling invisible." "What do you miss about me?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. "From before? When I was just the dangerous man in the black sedan." "The mystery," she said. "And now I miss that sometimes. Now that I know you completely, now that I understand the calculations behind every decision you make, I sometimes miss the days when you seemed larger than life, when you were more idea than person." "I'm still larger than life," he said, amusement in his voice. "You are," she agreed. "But now you're also just a person who loves me, a person who's learning to be better, a person who uses power to help instead of harm. That's somehow larger than the idea." They stood together as Seoul woke up around them, watching the city transform from night to day. Somewhere down there, in neighborhoods they'd transformed, in communities they'd rebuilt, in businesses they'd invested in, their legacy was taking root. Not the legacy of violence and fear that Jinwoo had built before, but the legacy of transformation and hope. By year 2, the transformation was complete enough that even the most skeptical observers in Seoul's underground had to acknowledge it. Jinwoo Park had become something new, not exactly legitimate, not exactly criminal, but existing in a space where both worlds intersected. He maintained enough connection to organized crime to remain relevant and protect his interests, but he directed so much energy toward legitimate business and community development that his actual criminal operations had shrunk to a fraction of what they'd once been. The profits he lost from abandoning illicit enterprise were more than compensated for by the returns from legitimate businesses and real estate development. More importantly, he was happy. Not in the explosive, adrenaline-fueled way that violence and domination had made him happy, but in a quieter, deeper way that came from building something that mattered, from loving someone completely, from using his power for creation rather than destruction. He found joy in the small moments. Watching an elderly resident benefit from community programming, seeing a young entrepreneur succeed, receiving reports that crime in the neighborhoods where they'd invested had dropped significantly. Amara was different too. She was no longer the desperate street vendor scratching out a living in Seoul's markets, working 18-hour days for survival. She was a businesswoman, an entrepreneur, a community developer with influence and resources. She sat on boards and made decisions that affected thousands of people. She spoke at conferences about her journey from the margins to the center of Seoul's economy. She used her platform to advocate for the protection of street vendors and informal workers, the people she'd been, the people she understood from the inside. 6 months after the cafe incubator opened, 3 young entrepreneurs had graduated from the program and opened their own restaurants. One of them, a woman named Jiwoo who'd been working a similar cart to Amara's, cried when Amara came to the opening of her restaurant. "I wouldn't be here without what you did," Jiwoo said. "I wouldn't have believed it was possible." Amara understood then what Jinwoo had understood months before. Transformation wasn't just about changing yourself. It was about creating the conditions for others to change. It was about using power to build rather than destroy, to create opportunity rather than exploit desperation. It was about recognizing that legacy wasn't measured in fear or control, but in the lives touched and transformed by your choices. The final threat came from an unexpected direction, testing everything they'd built. A rival organization, frustrated by years of trying to reclaim territory from Jinwoo and watching his power actually increase rather than decrease, attempted a coordinated attack on his legitimate businesses. They were desperate men making desperate calculations, believing that attacking community centers and threatening young entrepreneurs would weaken Jinwoo's resolve or distract him from his underground operations. They were wrong. For 48 hours, Amara watched him become the man he'd been before she knew him. Ruthless, calculating, absolutely willing to use violence to protect what mattered. She watched as his organization mobilized with the precision of a military force, moving through the city with coordinated efficiency. She watched as criminals were dealt with, not through the legal system, but through the consequences of crossing someone with both legitimate power and underground connections. It was terrifying and fascinating, watching the man she loved transform into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. And then, as quickly as it had escalated, it ended. The rival organization backed down, realizing they'd miscalculated fundamentally. The threat ceased. Jinwoo returned to the penthouse looking exhausted and haunted by the choices he'd made. And she saw the internal conflict play across his features. The struggle between who he wanted to be and who he'd needed to become. "I was someone else for 2 days," he said to her, and she heard the regret in his voice. "You were protecting people you love," Amara said. "That's not being someone else. That's being someone willing to do difficult things for people who matter." There's a difference between violence driven by power hunger and violence driven by protection and love. She came to stand beside him, pulling him into an embrace despite her pregnancy making the movement awkward. Despite his clothes carrying the smell of Seoul's underworld. Despite everything in her that wanted to judge what he'd done. But she understood that judging him now would be abandoning him when he needed her most. "Is there?" he asked. "Or did I just tell myself that to justify becoming that person again?" "Come with me," she said, taking his hand. They went to the observation window, looking down at Seoul. She pointed to the community centers, to the neighborhoods that had been transformed, to the businesses that were thriving. "Look at what we built. Look at the people whose lives have changed. That's real. That happened because you chose to use your power differently. 2 days of old behavior doesn't erase months of new behavior. It just means you're human. It means you're struggling with who you want to be. But look where you ended up. You're still choosing to build instead of destroy. You just had to fight for that choice." He pulled her close, and they stood together watching Seoul. The city that had shaped them both, that had brought them together, that was slowly being transformed by their choices. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to know that I'm asking as the person I'm becoming, not the person I was." "What?" she asked, though she already knew. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not because I need to possess you, though I won't lie, I want to, but because I want to commit to this transformation publicly. I want to be someone's husband instead of someone's feared boss. I want to build a life with you that extends beyond business partnerships and community projects. I want to promise you forever." She didn't hesitate. She'd already committed to him in every way that mattered. Making it official was just the final transformation. The shift from protection to partnership, from obsession to love, from a story about a powerful man protecting a vulnerable woman to a story about 2 people choosing to build something beautiful together. "Yes," she said. The wedding was small and private, held in the community center that had started their transformation. Mrs. Park was there, her eyes bright with tears as she watched the street vendor she'd befriended become a wife. The entrepreneurs Amara had mentored were there, young people who'd launched businesses from nothing because someone had believed in them and invested resources to make it possible. Minjun was there, witnessing the completion of his boss's evolution from feared criminal to genuine partner in someone's life. The security team that had become something like family stood in the background, proud of the man they served for choosing love and transformation over continued violence. They celebrated not just a marriage, but the completion of a journey. The journey from street vendor to partner of soul's most powerful man, from protected to protector, from invisible to seen. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, focused on the commitment they were making not just to each other, but to the work they would continue doing together. There were no promises of happily ever after. Amara had learned that life was more complicated than that. But there were promises of partnership, of facing challenges together, of choosing each other daily. In the months that followed, other changes accumulated with the weight of genuine transformation. Amara became pregnant, and they prepared for a child who would be born into a world that was fundamentally different because of choices they'd made. The cafe incubator expanded, creating dozens of small businesses that employed hundreds of people who'd previously felt trapped by Seoul's economic stratification. The community centers continued their work, transforming neighborhoods block by block, creating islands of opportunity in the city's most struggling districts. Jinwoo's legitimate businesses grew stronger, while his criminal operations continued their slow dissolution, not suddenly abandoned but gradually redirected toward legal enterprise. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still moments of fear, still occasional threats, still days when Jinwoo would have to become the man he'd been before to protect what they'd built. But there was also genuine happiness. There was partnership. There was the understanding that transformation wasn't a single moment, but a daily choice to be better, to build more, to love deeper. The pregnancy transformed Jinwoo in ways that nothing else had. He read parenting books with the same intensity he brought to business planning. He attended childbirth classes with her, learning how to support her through contractions and labor. He prepared the nursery with meticulous care, painting the walls himself in soft shades that would welcome his child. For the first time he was nervous. Not about his empire or his business interests, but about whether he'd be a good father, whether he could teach his child to be better than he'd been, whether the violence and darkness of his past would somehow damage the innocence of his child. "You're going to be an incredible father," Amara told him one night as she sat on the edge of their bed, massaging her swollen feet. "You know why? Because you're asking the question. You're wondering if you're good enough. The worst fathers don't ask that. The worst fathers assume they're perfect. You're terrified of messing this up. That means you'll be careful. That means you'll think about every decision. That means you'll love this child fiercely enough to want to be better than you were." He knelt before her and placed his hands on her belly, feeling their daughter move beneath his palms. "I was a terrible person," he said. "I hurt people. I destroyed lives. I profited from others' suffering. How do I explain that to our daughter? How do I reconcile the man I was with the man I'm trying to become?" "You tell her the truth," Amara said. "You tell her that people can change. You tell her that the worst parts of your past don't have to define your future. You tell her that love is worth becoming better for. And you show her, every single day, you show her, that transformation is possible." When labor started 3 weeks early, Jinwoo was there. When the contractions became intense and Amara screamed through the pain, he held her hand and whispered encouragement. When their daughter was born, small and perfect and screaming into the world, he cut the cord with hands that had once wielded violence with such precision. But now those hands were gentle. Now those hands were devoted to this new life that represented every possibility they'd fought to build together. They named her Solmi, Soul Beloved. A name that connected their daughter to the city that had brought her parents together, to the streets where Amara had worked and the empire Jinwoo had ruled, and the transformation that had changed everything. One evening, almost 3 years after that first meeting in the market, Amara stood in the cafe incubator with Jinwoo, watching young entrepreneurs prepare their restaurants for opening. She was 6 months pregnant, and her body ached in new ways. But her soul felt lighter than it had in years. "Do you remember," Jinwoo asked, coming to stand beside her, "when you were so afraid of me that you could barely look me in the eyes?" "I remember being afraid," she said. "But I was never afraid of you. I was afraid of what you represented. I was afraid that caring about you would make me weak. I was afraid that accepting protection meant losing independence." "And now?" he asked. Now I understand that strength isn't about doing everything alone, she said. Strength is about choosing to build something with someone, even when it's scary. Strength is about letting someone love you completely. Strength is about using whatever power you have to help instead of harm. He took her hand, placed it on her belly where their child moved beneath her skin, and she felt the completion of it all. The street vendor had become a businesswoman. The dangerous man had become a partner. Seoul had been transformed by two people who'd chosen to love each other, and let that love reshape their worlds. The story that had started with danger and obsession had become a story about transformation and hope. And the best chapters, the ones where they would teach their child to build and create and love, the ones where they would continue expanding their community impact, the ones where Jinwoo would finally achieve the complete legitimacy he now desired. Those chapters were still being written. Outside the cafe incubator, Seoul hummed with its endless energy. But inside, Amara and Jinwoo stood together, watching the future they'd created, understanding that the greatest power wasn't the ability to control others, but the ability to inspire them to build better versions of themselves. And they had that power. They'd always have that power, because they'd learned it from each other. Subscribe to see what happens next in Amara and Jinwoo's journey. Comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you and know how far our story has taken you. Because this is just the beginning of a new chapter. The chapter where Amara gives birth to their child. The chapter where Jinwoo completes his full transition into legitimate business. The chapter where the community they've built begins to expand beyond Seoul into other cities, other neighborhoods, other lives in need of transformation. The real work. The work of sustained change, of building legacy, of raising a child who will inherit a world changed by their parents' choices. That work is only just beginning, and the best is yet to come.